I was standing in my kitchen, my coffee still hot in my hand, when the bank asked me a question that made my knees give out. "Ma'am, are you confirming today's $180,000 disbursement against your home?" For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard her. I said, very slowly, "I'm sorry." "What money?" The woman on the phone paused, just long enough for fear to crawl up my spine. "The $180,000 home equity line of credit," she repeated. "We're calling to complete final verification. My house was paid off, every inch of it. I had lived there for 27 years. I raised my son there. I buried my husband from that address. I had never taken out a loan on it. Not once." My hand started shaking so badly I had to set the coffee mug down before I dropped it. "I didn't apply for any loan." I said, "I didn't authorize anything." Another pause. Then she said something that turned my fear into pure ice. "We already spoke earlier today, ma'am." The authorization was confirmed. In that moment, my kitchen felt very far away. I looked around at the familiar things that had always made me feel safe. The calendar with my doctor's appointment circled in blue ink, the little bowl where I keep my house keys, the folder on the counter labelled Property Taxes 2024. Nothing had changed, and yet somehow my name had just been used to put my home on the line. I asked the only question that made sense. "Who did you speak to?" She gave me a polite answer, the kind trained voices give when something is very wrong. "You," she said, or someone who said they were you. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I sat down at the kitchen table because suddenly my legs would not hold me anymore. I was 63 years old. I lived alone. I paid my bills on time. I balanced my own checkbook. I had never missed a mortgage payment back when I had one. And now a stranger was telling me that my house was minutes away from being tied to a debt I had never agreed to. I took a breath and asked her why the bank was calling me again if the authorization had already happened. She explained it calmly. The way banks do, large disbursements sometimes trigger a secondary verification, especially when something changes at the last minute. The amount, the timing, the account, receiving the funds. That second phone call was routine. That second phone call was the only reason my life didn't collapse that morning, because if they had not called, the money would have been released. $180,000 against my home. I felt a cold realization settle in my chest. Someone very close to me had already spoken to them, someone who knew my personal information, someone who knew how I talked, someone who knew the answers to my security questions, someone who knew my life well enough to pretend to be me. I thanked the woman at the bank and asked her to pause everything immediately. She told me a fraud case would be opened and that someone would contact me shortly. When I hung up, the house was silent. Too silent. I stared at the phone in my hand and tried to understand how this could be happening without me knowing. Then one name came to mind. It wasn't a stranger. It was someone who had been sitting at my table, and my stomach dropped. I didn't call anyone right away. I didn't even stand up. I just sat there, staring at the little bowl where I keep my keys, like it might explain what I had missed. Then I did something I almost never do. I checked my front door, locked. I checked the back door, locked. I checked the mailbox, even though the mail had already come, empty. It sounds silly, but in that moment I needed to confirm that my world was still mine. Then I opened my phone and looked at my notes app. I keep simple things in there: grocery lists, reminders, the name of the plumber I like, and sitting there, right under a shopping list, was something I did not remember typing, a set of personal details, my mother's maiden name, the street I grew up on, the name of my first dog. It was written neatly, like someone had copied it down on purpose. That was the moment I stopped thinking this was a mistake, because that wasn't a guess. That was preparation. And if someone had taken the time to write my life down like a recipe, then that $180,000 was not the first thing they were after. It was just the first thing they thought they could get quickly. Before I go any further, let me be clear. This story is drawn from real situations and real patterns shared by many families. A few details have been adjusted for privacy and clarity, and the visuals you see are AI generated to help you feel the moment. If today is heavy for you, take care of yourself and come back when you are ready. And if you stay, leave a comment so I know you are here. I sat there for a long time after that call. I replayed every recent conversation in my head, every time someone had offered to help me with paperwork, every time I had been told gently that things were confusing, that it would be easier if someone else handled it. I thought about how often women my age are told the same thing, that we are forgetful, that we are vulnerable, that someone else knows better. I had believed none of that applied to me until the bank said my name had already been used. I picked up my phone again, this time scrolling through recent calls, and there it was, a number I recognized instantly. Not the bank, family. That was when I realized something worse than the money itself. If this had gone through, I would not have just lost financial security. I would have lost control over my own life. So let me ask you this, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. If someone you trusted used your voice, your name, and your personal information to risk everything you worked for, how far would you go to stop them, even if it meant breaking your own family apart after that phone call? I did what most women my age do when something feels off. I cleaned. I wiped the counter that was already clean. I rinsed a mug that didn't need rinsing. I straightened a stack of mail I had already opened. It was my way of thinking without admitting I was scared. I kept telling myself there had to be a simple explanation, a clerical error, a misunderstanding, a crossed phone number. Banks do not just hand out $180,000 because someone asks nicely. They have rules, they have safeguards. That thought comforted me for about 30 seconds. Then I remembered the voice on the phone saying they had already spoken to me, or someone who sounded like me. I sat back down at the kitchen table and started replaying the past few months in my head. Not the dramatic moments, the small ones, the everyday moments you do not think twice about, like the afternoon my daughter-in-law offered to help me organise my paperwork. She had said it so casually. "You have a lot of folders, Mum. I can help you sort them so you do not have to worry." At the time, it sounded thoughtful, practical, kind. I remember standing next to her while she flipped through my files, insurance, property taxes, bank statements. She had laughed and said, "Wow, they make this stuff so confusing." I had laughed too, because she was right. Then there were the phone calls, the times she sat beside me on the couch while I called the bank or the insurance company. She would say things like, "Speak up, Mum," or "Put it on speaker so I can hear." I didn't think anything of it. Families help each other. That is what I believed. And then there were the little comments. They were never cruel, never loud, just small suggestions dropped like pennies into a jar. This stuff can be overwhelming. You have been through a lot. It might be easier if someone else handled it. I brushed them off every time. I drove myself. I paid my bills. I knew exactly how much money I had. But looking back now, I can see something I didn't see then. She was not helping. She was learning how I spoke, learning what information I used, learning which questions I answered without hesitation, learning how to be me. That realization made my stomach turn. I stood up and walked to the hallway closet where I keep my files. I opened the door and pulled out the metal filing box. It felt heavier than usual. I sat on the floor and opened it, one folder at a time. Everything looked normal, too normal. And then I noticed something small, an envelope from the bank that I didn't remember opening. It was already torn at the top. That might not sound like much, but I am a careful person. I open my mail at the table. I keep envelopes until I'm done reading them. This one had been opened, read, and put back. Not by me. I held that envelope in my hand for a long time. I could feel something shifting inside me. Fear, yes, but also anger, quiet anger, the kind that does not shout or throw things, the kind that sharpens your focus. I went back to my phone and scrolled through recent calls again. There it was. The number, her number, not the bank, not the insurance company. Family. I didn't call her right away. That might surprise you, but something told me not to. If this was a mistake, I didn't want to accuse her unfairly, and if it was not a mistake, I needed to be careful, very careful. So instead, I called the bank back. I asked them what would happen next. They explained that a fraud case had been opened and that no money would move until everything was reviewed. They also told me something important. The earlier call had been recorded. My heart skipped when I heard that, recorded. That meant there was proof, not feelings, not suspicions, facts. I hung up and sat there in silence again. I thought about how often women my age are told to trust family first, how often we are told that questioning loved ones makes us difficult or ungrateful. I thought about how easily kindness can be used against us. I also thought about my son, the boy I raised, the man I loved more than my own comfort. If this went where I feared it was going, it would not just be about money, it would be about him too. That night I barely slept. Every sound made me sit up. Every creak of the house felt louder than it ever had before. In the morning, I made myself breakfast like everything was normal. Toast, coffee, the news playing softly in the background, but nothing was normal anymore. I realised something important that morning. Whoever made that phone call believed they were safe. They believed no one would question it. They believed I would never find out. And that belief came from familiarity, from access, from trust. That is what made it so dangerous. Before we go on, if you are finding this story meaningful, this is a good moment to quietly subscribe to the channel. It helps these stories reach the people who need them most. And please take a moment to check in with yourself. Unclench your jaw, take a breath, drink some water if you need to. And I would love to hear from you. What time is it where you are right now? And where are you listening from as you hear this story unfold? The next few days passed in a strange, quiet fog. Nothing exploded. No one confessed. No money moved. And that was exactly what made it unsettling. On the surface, life went on as usual. I watered my plants. I folded laundry. I drove to the grocery store and debated for a full minute whether I really needed another carton of eggs. But underneath all of that, something had changed. I had stopped feeling like the owner of my own life. Every sound of my phone made my chest tighten. Every unknown number felt heavier than it should. And then the comments started, not directly at first. My daughter-in-law would say things that sounded caring to anyone else. You seem tired lately. Are you sleeping enough? You know, stress can make people forgetful. She said it gently, almost sweetly. If you were standing in the room, you would have nodded and thought she was being thoughtful. But I heard something else. I heard a story being built. That was her deadly lie. Not that I was forgetful, but that I was no longer the owner of my own life. One afternoon, my son stopped by after work. He sat at the kitchen table where I had raised him, the same table where I had just days earlier been told my house was on the line. He looked uncomfortable. That alone told me everything. He asked me how I was feeling. I told him the truth. I was fine. He hesitated. Then he said something that cut deeper than anything else so far. She is just worried about you. Mum, that was it. That was the sentence. Not you are wrong, not there was a mistake, just she is worried about you. That is when I realised the lie was already doing its job. Not a loud lie, a quiet one, the kind that sounds reasonable, the kind that makes you question yourself before anyone else ever does. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I simply asked him a question, worried about what exactly. He shrugged and said, you know, things. That word stayed with me long after he left, because when people cannot name the problem, it is usually because the problem does not really exist. That night, I sat alone in my living room with the lights low and thought about every woman I knew who had ever been told she was confused. I thought about friends who had lost control of their finances because someone else stepped in to help. I thought about how easy it would be for someone to say I was overwhelmed or grieving or slipping, and how hard it would be to prove I was not. The next morning, I decided to do something small but important. I scheduled a routine appointment with my doctor, not because I needed one, but because I wanted a record. I wanted my own quiet proof. The appointment was normal. We talked about blood pressure, cholesterol, sleep. She asked me questions. I answered clearly. At the end, she smiled and said, "You are doing just fine." I walked out of that office feeling steadier than I had in days, because now I knew something for sure. The problem was not me. It was the story being told about me. Later that week, my daughter-in-law stopped by unannounced. She always had a way of doing that. She glanced around the house as if she were checking on something. Then she sat down and sighed. "You have a lot on your plate," she said. There it was again. I nodded politely. She leaned forward and said something that made my skin prickle. "We just want to make sure everything is handled properly. Before anything happens. Before anything happens." I asked her what she meant. She smiled and waved her hand. You know, life. That smile was new. Too practiced. Too calm. I realised then that she believed her own version of events. In her mind, she was not taking advantage. She was being proactive. She was helping. And people who believe they are helping surely see the damage they cause. That evening, I went back through my files again, slowly, carefully. This time, I was not looking for missing papers. I was looking for patterns, and I found one. There were sticky notes on several documents, small notes, written in her handwriting, just reminders. I had thought at the time, call bank, update info, check credit. Each note felt harmless on its own. Together, they told a different story. This was not sudden, this was planned. That night, I received a text from her. It said, "We should really talk soon." No greeting, no warmth, just a suggestion that felt more like a direction. I stared at the screen for a long time before putting the phone down. I didn't respond. Not yet. Because now I understood something important. She was not worried about me losing control. She was worried about losing hers, and the more I stayed calm, the more dangerous that became for her. I slept better that night than I had in days, not because the problem was gone, but because I had stopped doubting myself. I knew who I was. I knew what I had not authorised. And I knew that whatever came next would require me to be very clear-headed, very deliberate, because the next move would not be small, and whoever made that phone call had no idea how much evidence they had already left behind. So here is the question I want you to think about as we move forward. When someone starts telling the world that you are not capable of protecting yourself, what is the one thing you must do before they convince everyone else, including your own family, that they are right? The morning after that text, I woke up with a strange sense of calm, not peace, clarity, the kind that comes when you stop hoping a situation will fix itself. I made my bed, opened the curtains, and let the light in like I always did. Then I made coffee and sat at the table with a notebook, not to write feelings, to write facts, what I knew, what I didn't know, and what I had never agreed to. I wrote down one sentence and underlined it. I didn't authorize a loan. Seeing it on paper grounded me. Because when people start suggesting you are confused, the first thing they take is your confidence in your own memory. I was not going to give that up. Around noon, my daughter-in-law showed up again. This time, she didn't smile right away. She came in holding a thin folder and set it gently on the table between us. I remember thinking how deliberate that movement was, like she had practiced it. She sat down and said she had been doing some research. That word, research, she said it was about options, just in case. She slid the folder toward me. Inside were papers I recognized instantly. Home equity line of credit documents, not signed, not completed, but real. My heart thudded once, hard. She spoke calmly, slowly. This is just for emergencies. You never know what could happen. I flipped through the pages without responding. The amount was right there, $180,000. I asked her why she thought I needed this. She sighed. The kind of sigh meant to sound patient. You have assets, she said. It would be irresponsible not to use them if something came up. There it was. The shift? My house was no longer my home. It was an asset. I closed the folder and pushed it back to her. I said I was not signing anything. Her expression changed for just a second. Not anger, annoyance. She recovered quickly and smiled again. We can go over it together later, she said. Maybe with a notary, so it is easier. That word landed heavier than it should have. Notary. I told her I wanted to talk to a lawyer first. She waved her hand like I had said something silly. You do not need to involve outsiders. She said, this is family. That sentence did something to me. Because family should never be a reason to rush or hide. Family should not be afraid of transparency. I stood up and told her I needed time to think. She gathered the folder and left it on the counter anyway, just in case. After she left, I stood there staring at that folder for a long time. Then I picked it up and put it back in the filing box. Not to sign, to remember. That afternoon, I called the bank again. At this time, I didn't sound scared. I asked questions. What kind of loan was it? When was the initial call? What information had been used to verify identity? The woman on the phone was careful but helpful. She confirmed that the earlier call had been placed from a personal phone, not a landline and not a branch, a personal phone. She also told me something else. The person who called sounded confident. They didn't hesitate. They didn't ask questions. They knew what to say. That detail stuck with me. Confidence is not something strangers usually have when dealing with banks. Confidence comes from familiarity, from practice. That evening, my son called. He asked if everything was okay. I told him I was handling it. He sounded relieved, not because the problem was solved, but because he didn't want to choose sides. I understood that, but it still hurt. Later that night, I pulled out my old calendar, the one I still write in by hand. I went back several weeks and marked dates. Days my daughter-in-law had visited, days she had helped with paperwork, days she had sat beside me on calls. A pattern began to form, nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just steady presence, access, opportunity. I realised then that the paperwork on my counter was not the plan, it was the backup, because the real move had already happened. The phone call, the one I didn't make, the one that almost worked. That was when the fear returned, sharp and focused, because if that call had gone through, the papers would have been a formality, a clean-up step. I sat there with that realisation and felt a chill run through me. This was not about helping me prepare for the future. This was about acting before I could stop it, before I could say no, before anyone asked too many questions. I went to bed that night knowing something I had not fully accepted before. I was no longer dealing with a misunderstanding. I was dealing with intent, and intent changes everything. As I turned off the light, one thought stayed with me. If she was willing to make that phone call without my knowledge, what else had she already done that I had not discovered yet by the time I reached this point? I stopped asking myself whether that phone call had really happened. It had. What I needed to understand now was how. Because phone calls do not authorize loans by accident. They authorize loans because the person on the other end knows exactly what to say. I drove to the bank in person the next morning, not because I expected answers right away, but because I needed to sit across from someone and look them in the eye. The branch felt the same as it always had, soft lighting, neutral colours, the quiet hum of printers and keyboards. Normal. I told the woman at the desk that a fraud case had been opened on my account. She nodded and asked me to wait. While I sat there, I watched people come and go. A man depositing a cheque, a couple asking about retirement accounts, an older woman counting cash slowly at the counter, life moving on. I wondered how many of us sitting there believed our finances were safe simply because they always had been. When I was finally called into a small office, the fraud specialist was calm and professional. She didn't rush me. She asked me to tell her what I knew, not what I felt, facts. So I told her I had not applied for a loan. I told her I had not authorised any disbursement. I told her that someone else had called pretending to be me. She listened carefully and typed notes as I spoke. Then she explained what they had so far. There was a recorded phone call from earlier that week. The caller identified herself as me. She passed the identity verification questions. She requested the release of funds tied to a home equity line of credit. The process had moved forward because nothing in that call raised immediate red flags. Until the second verification call, until me, that part was hard to hear. Not because the bank had failed, but because the impersonation had worked. At least at first, the fraud specialist told me they could not let me hear the recording yet, not without a formal request. But she did confirm something important. The call didn't come from my phone. It came from a personal cell phone, not a bank office, not a landline, a personal phone. That detail echoed in my mind all the way home. I replayed every time my daughter-in-law had sat next to me while I called customer service. Every time she had told me to put it on speaker. Every time she had laughed and said banks make this stuff so complicated. It had not been complicated to her. It had been educational. That afternoon, I pulled out my notebook again. This time, I wrote down everything I could remember about how I answered security questions, which ones I hesitated on, which ones I answered automatically. Your first car, the street you grew up on, the name of your childhood pet, things family members often know without realising how valuable they are. I realised then that the phone call itself was not the boldest part. The boldest part was the confidence, the belief that no one would challenge it, that I would never know, that if I did, I would doubt myself before I doubted family. That belief almost worked. Later that evening, my daughter-in-law texted me again. She asked if I'd gone to the bank. I didn't answer. I was done explaining. I was done reassuring. Silence, I learned, can be very unsettling to people who expect control. That night, I received an email from the bank. It confirmed that the disbursement had been frozen pending investigation. I read that sentence 3 times. Frozen. Safe. For now. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in days, but relief didn't last long because safety has a way of making the truth clearer. If the money had not moved, it was only because of timing, because of procedure, because of a second phone call, not because the attempt had failed. It had nearly succeeded, and attempts often come in pairs. I lay awake thinking about that, thinking about how close I had come to waking up with a debt I didn't choose, thinking about how the paperwork my daughter-in-law brought over suddenly made sense. It was not the start of the plan. It was the cleanup. The call came first. The documents would have followed, all neat, all legal-looking, all signed under pressure and concern. I wondered how many other people had not gotten that second call, how many had signed something because they were told it was for their own good, how many had been quietly pushed aside in the name of help. The next morning, I found myself standing in front of the filing box again. This time, I was not looking for missing documents. I was preparing. I pulled out my identification, my bank statements, my property records. I made copies. I labelled folders. I didn't feel panicked. I felt focused, because once you understand how something was done, you understand how to stop it from happening again. But there was one thing I still needed: proof, not suspicion, not intuition. Proof that tied the phone call to a person. And deep down, I knew exactly where that proof would lead. So here is what I want you to hold on to as we move forward. If a single phone call almost cost me my home, what do you think happens when the recording of that call is finally played out loud and the person who made it realizes everyone can hear the truth? Once I understood how close I had come to losing everything, something inside me shifted. I stopped reacting. I started preparing. There is a difference. Reacting comes from fear. Preparing comes from clarity. The first thing I did was call an elder law attorney, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted protection. I found one through a local referral, a woman about my age with a calm voice and an office that smelled faintly of coffee and old books. She listened without interrupting. I told her everything: the phone call, the paperwork, the comments about me being overwhelmed, the pressure to keep things in the family. When I finished, she didn't look surprised. She nodded slowly and said something that stayed with me. This happens more often than people think. She explained that what I was describing fit a pattern: gradual involvement, helpful presence, subtle suggestions about capacity, and then a financial move made quietly and quickly. She didn't dramatize it. That somehow made it worse. She told me the most important thing was documentation, not confrontation. So that became my focus. I gathered what mattered: the emails, the dates, the opened envelope that wasn't opened by me, small facts that told one big truth. The dates my daughter-in-law had visited, the notes she had left behind, nothing flashy, just facts. I also did something that felt strangely empowering. I froze my credit, all 3 agencies. It took less than an hour. I did it at my kitchen table with my reading glasses sliding down my nose, the way they always do. The websites were not friendly. The questions felt endless. And halfway through, I almost laughed, not because it was funny, because it was absurd that after raising a child, paying decades of bills, and surviving grief, I still had to prove I was me. One of the sites asked for a verification code sent to my phone. I stared at that little spinning circle and thought, if she had been sitting next to me right now, she would have offered to help. She would have reached for the phone. She would have said, "Let me handle it." And that was exactly why I was doing it alone. When the final confirmation page popped up, it didn't feel like a computer task anymore. It felt like I had locked a window that had been left open for years without me noticing. Then I took one more step. I changed every password that mattered, the bank, the email connected to the bank, even the password to my Wi-Fi, because I suddenly understood something I never used to think about. Access is not always a key in someone's pocket. Sometimes it is a smile across your kitchen tables. When I finished, I felt lighter, like I had locked a door I didn't realize had been open. The attorney sent what she called a preservation request to the bank, a formal letter asking them to retain all records related to the phone call, the recording, the metadata, the verification steps, everything. That letter mattered. It meant nothing could quietly disappear. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks, not because the problem was solved, but because I was no longer alone in it. The next few days were quiet again, too quiet. My daughter-in-law didn't call. She didn't text. She didn't stop by. That absence spoke louder than anything she had said before. People who believe they are in control do not like silence. Silence means uncertainty. My son came over that weekend. He looked tired, older. He asked me why I had involved a lawyer. I told him the truth, because someone tried to take a loan out in my name. He said she was just trying to help. I asked him one question if someone else had done this to me. Would you still say that? He didn't answer right away. That pause told me everything. Later that day, I received a call from the bank. They wanted to schedule a formal fraud interview. I agreed. When the day came, I dressed carefully, not to impress, to remind myself who I was. I sat at my kitchen table with my documents neatly arranged. The investigator was polite and methodical. She asked me to confirm basic information. Then she asked me to describe the phone call I had not made. I told her I could not describe it because it was not me. She nodded. She told me they had reviewed the recording internally. They were now comparing it to other verified calls I had made in the past. That made my stomach flip. Voice patterns, speech habits, the way someone answers questions. I'd never thought of my voice as something that could be analysed, but apparently it could. She also told me something else. The caller had hesitated briefly on one of the security questions, then answered confidently. That detail mattered, because people answering from memory do not hesitate the same way people recalling information secondhand do. That night, I thought about how often I had let my daughter-in-law sit beside me during calls, how often she had listened, how often she had said nothing at all. I realised that being quiet had been part of her learning. The next morning, the attorney called. She told me the bank had agreed to keep the funds frozen until the investigation was complete. She also told me something I had not fully considered. This was no longer just about stopping a loan. This was about intent, and intent had consequences. That word made my heart pound. Consequences. I was not looking to destroy anyone, but I was done protecting someone who had not protected me. I went back through my calendar again. This time, I noticed something new. The date of the phone call lined up exactly with the day my daughter-in-law had been at my house for hours, helping, organising, sitting beside me while I made calls. The pieces were no longer scattered. They were aligning that afternoon. I found something else, an email confirmation about an account inquiry that I had never made. It was subtle, easy to miss, but it was there, another breadcrumb, another sign that the phone call had not been a one-time mistake. It had been part of a larger attempt. I realized then that I was no longer just protecting myself. I was uncovering something. And once you start uncovering the truth, you cannot stop halfway, because stopping halfway is how people like her count on getting away with it. So as I sat there, surrounded by folders and notes and dates circled in ink, I understood one thing very clearly. The evidence was almost complete, and the only thing left was the moment when someone would have to hear their own voice played back to them and realize that the story they built was about to collapse. And that moment was closer than they thought. The days leading up to that meeting felt longer than they should have. My attorney filed a formal request for a recorded call review. The bank agreed, but only in a controlled meeting, with an investigator present. My son was there because the investigator insisted he hear it for himself, not because anything dramatic happened, but because everything was waiting. Waiting has a way of wearing you down. I kept myself busy. I cooked simple meals. I walked around the block every morning. I made lists and crossed things off just to remind myself that I was still in control of my day. But underneath all of that, I knew what was coming. The bank called to confirm the time, the investigator, the attorney, a conference room, and the recording. I didn't tell my son right away. I didn't want him to hear it secondhand. I wanted him to hear the truth directly, without my voice shaping it. When the day arrived, I dressed carefully again, comfortable clothes, nothing stiff, nothing dramatic. I was not going to court. I was going to tell the truth. The meeting took place at the bank branch, in a small room with a long table and a speakerphone in the centre. The investigator was there, my attorney was there, and then my son walked in alone. That alone told me something. He sat down across from me and avoided my eyes at first. No one rushed, no one accused. The investigator explained the purpose of the meeting in calm, plain language. They were there to review evidence related to an attempted unauthorised loan. Then she said they would play a recorded phone call. I felt my heart pick up speed, but my hands stayed steady. The recording started. At first, it sounded like any customer service call, polite, confident, familiar. The voice on the recording said my name, said my address, answered the initial verification questions without hesitation. I watched my son's face as he listened. At first, he looked confused, then he frowned, then his posture changed because the voice sounded close enough to be convincing, but not close enough to be right. There were small things, the rhythm, the way she rushed through certain answers, the way she spoke over the representative instead of pausing the way I always did. The investigator stopped the recording at one point and pointed out something subtle, a hesitation, just a second too long before answering one of the security questions. Then confidence. That pattern mattered. People answering from memory do not hesitate the same way people recalling information do. The room was quiet. Too quiet. The recording ended. No one spoke for a moment. Then my son cleared his throat. He asked one question. Where did the call come from? The investigator answered, a personal cell phone, not mine. She slid a document across the table. Most of the number was covered, but the last 4 digits were visible. My son went still the moment he saw them. Those were the same last 4 digits she'd had for years. My son stared at it. I could see the realization spreading across his face in slow motion. He didn't look at me. He didn't say anything. The investigator continued. She explained that the call had triggered a series of automated steps. The paperwork that had appeared later was consistent with that timeline. This was not preparation, it was follow-through. The intent was already there. I sat quietly through all of this, not because I was detached, but because there was nothing left to say. The truth didn't need my help anymore. When the meeting ended, the investigator explained the next steps. The loan would remain frozen. The case would be documented. Further action would be determined by the bank and authorities. My attorney nodded. We gathered our things. As we stood to leave, my son finally looked at me. His eyes were wet. He said my name softly, just once. I didn't respond right away, because sometimes silence is the only honest response. We walked out together. Outside, he stopped and apologized, not loudly, not dramatically, just a simple, "I am sorry." I told him I loved him, and I meant it, but love does not erase reality. Over the next few days, the story unraveled in a way that felt almost unreal. At first, she acted offended, like the whole thing was a misunderstanding. Then the bank asked one simple question she could not answer. "Why did the bank receive that call from your number?" Not mine. She said she was trying to protect the family. She said she was planning ahead. She said she didn't think it would be a big deal. That sentence stayed with me. She didn't think it would be a big deal, taking out a loan in my name, using my voice, risking my home. Not a big deal. That was when I understood something important. She didn't regret the action. She regretted being caught. The bank followed through. The account was flagged permanently. Extra protections were put in place. Every future change would require in-person verification. I updated my legal documents, my will, my power of attorney, all with neutral professionals, no family involvement, not as punishment, as protection. Life began to settle again, not back to normal, but into something steadier, something clearer. I started sleeping better. I stopped jumping every time my phone rang. I felt ownership return, slowly, quietly. One afternoon, I found myself standing in the same kitchen where this all began, the same counter, the same coffee mug, but this time, the space felt like mine again. I realized then that the most dangerous part of what happened was not the phone call. It was the assumption that I would never push back, that I would stay quiet to keep the peace, that I would accept someone else deciding what was best for me. That assumption was wrong, and the consequences of being wrong were just beginning, because what happened next didn't take place in a bank or a lawyer's office. It happened behind closed doors, in the privacy of family conversations, where the real cost of that call would finally be paid. And that is where this story takes its sharpest turn. After the meeting at the bank, I thought the hardest part was over. I was wrong. The bank had done its job. The lawyer had done hers. The money was frozen. The evidence was documented. But families do not resolve themselves with paperwork. They unravel slowly, in kitchens and living rooms, in conversations that never quite sound the same again. My son didn't come by for a few days after that meeting. I didn't push. I had learned that forcing clarity too soon often makes people retreat further into denial. When he finally did come over, he didn't bring his wife. That alone told me more than words ever could. He sat in the same chair he always had, but he didn't lean back. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like he used to when he was a teenager and knew he had done something wrong. He asked me how I was holding up. I told him the truth. I was tired, but steady. He nodded. Then he said something quietly. She didn't tell me she made the call. That sentence landed heavily between us. Not because it surprised me, but because of what it meant. It meant the lie had not just been about money, it had been about control. I asked him what she had said instead. He took a long breath and told me. She said she thought I was overwhelmed. She said she believed it was the responsible thing to do. She said she planned to explain it later. Later, that word again. Later is where people hide the truth when they hope it will become easier with time. I asked him if he believed her. He didn't answer right away. Then he said something honest. I believe she thought she was helping. That was when I leaned back and let myself say what I had been holding in for weeks. Helping does not happen in secret. Helping does not require pretending to be someone else. Helping does not risk another person's home. He closed his eyes and nodded because he knew it was true. The days that followed were uncomfortable in a way that is hard to describe. No yelling, no dramatic confrontations, just distance. Phone calls went unanswered, plans were postponed, family gatherings felt awkward and strained. My daughter-in-law didn't reach out to me directly. She communicated through my son, apologies passed along like messages written on folded paper. She was sorry if I felt hurt. She had not meant any harm. She had only been trying to make sure everything was secure. Those words didn't bring relief. They brought clarity, because nowhere in those messages was there responsibility, no acknowledgement of the risk, no recognition of the boundary that had been crossed, just discomfort at the consequences. The bank finalised their internal review. They confirmed the attempt was unauthorised. They placed permanent safeguards on my account. Any future changes would require me to appear in person with identification. No exceptions. I signed the paperwork with a steady hand that felt like reclaiming something I didn't realise I had lost. My attorney helped me update my legal documents, my will, my power of attorney, my healthcare directives. I chose professionals, not family, not because I didn't love my family, but because love should never require surrendering control. As I went through that process, I felt something lift. The quiet fear that had settled into my daily life began to fade. I stopped checking my phone every time it buzzed. I stopped replaying conversations in my head at night. I began to feel at home in my own house again. One afternoon, weeks later, my daughter-in-law asked if she could come over to talk. I thought about it carefully before agreeing, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to be clear. When she arrived, she looked smaller somehow, less certain. She sat across from me at the kitchen table and spoke quickly. She said she was under pressure. She said money had been tight. She said she thought she was doing what was best. I listened, not because I needed the explanation, but because listening costs nothing and often reveals everything. When she finished, I told her something calmly. I told her that regardless of her intentions, what she had done was wrong, that she had used my identity without permission, that she had put my home at risk, and that because of that, certain boundaries were now permanent. She would not have access to my financial information. She would not handle my paperwork. She would not speak on my behalf to anyone, ever. She cried. She said I was tearing the family apart. I told her something I wish more women my age felt allowed to say. I am not tearing anything apart. I am protecting myself. That conversation didn't end with resolution. It ended with acceptance, the kind that comes when someone realizes they cannot undo what they have done. Life didn't return to the way it was before. It settled into something new, quieter, clearer. I still see my son. We talk. We rebuild in small ways. Trust does not snap back into place. It grows carefully with limits. I am okay with that because I learned something through all of this. Security is not just about locks and passwords. It is about boundaries, about knowing when kindness has turned into access, about recognizing when help has become control. The phone call that nearly cost me my home didn't just expose a lie. It exposed a belief, the belief that I would stay silent, that I would choose peace over truth. That belief was wrong. And that is why she regretted that phone call. Not because it failed, but because it woke me up. And once you wake up, you do not go back to sleep. What she didn't realize was that the story didn't end with the bank or the lawyer or even the family confrontation. The final chapter was quieter and far more powerful because it was the moment I rebuilt my life on my own terms. And that is exactly what I want to tell you about next. The strange part is the day after everything blew over, the world looked normal again. The grocery store still had the same sale signs. My neighbour still waved like nothing had happened. The sun still came through my kitchen window at the same angle. But I noticed something about myself. I used to move through life assuming the people closest to me would never put me at risk. I assumed love automatically meant safety. I assumed that if something felt wrong, it would be obvious, loud, impossible to miss. Now I knew the truth. The most dangerous threats often arrive wrapped in concern. So before I tell you how I rebuilt, I want to ask you something personal. If you had to choose today between being polite and being protected, which one would you choose? And if your answer scares you, what is one small step you could take this week to feel safer? After everything settled, I expected to feel triumphant. I did not. What I felt instead was quiet, the good kind of quiet, the kind that comes when your mind is no longer bracing for impact. My house didn't change. The walls were the same colour. The floors still creaked in the same places. The kitchen window still caught the afternoon light just right. But I had changed. I moved through my days differently. I walked a little slower. I breathed a little deeper. I trusted myself a little more. I realized something that surprised me. Losing my sense of safety had taught me how valuable it really was. For a long time, I had believed that being kind meant being accommodating, that being a good mother meant not making things uncomfortable, that being a good woman meant smoothing over tension even when it came at my own expense. This experience forced me to unlearn that. I learned that kindness without boundaries is not kindness at all. It is permission. I learned that silence does not always keep the peace. Sometimes it only keeps the truth from being spoken. I also learned something deeply personal. I learned that my voice matters even when it shakes, especially when it shakes. There were moments during this process when I wanted to stop, when I wanted to say it was too much trouble, when I wanted to tell myself it was easier to let things go. But every time I felt that pull, I asked myself one simple question: if I do not stand up for myself now, when will I ever? That question changed everything. I started to see my situation not as a betrayal, but as a turning point, a moment where life asked me to choose between comfort and clarity, between being liked and being safe, between avoiding conflict and protecting my future. I chose myself. That choice didn't make me cruel. It made me whole. I want to be honest with you. Standing up for myself didn't magically fix my family. Some relationships changed. Some became quieter. Some required distance. That was painful, but it was also honest. And honesty has a way of creating space for real healing instead of pretending. There is something freeing about knowing where you stand, about knowing what you will and will not accept, about knowing that your life is not a negotiation. I look back now and see how easily this could have gone another way if the bank had not made that second call, if I had brushed it off as a misunderstanding, if I had believed the story that I was confused instead of trusting my own memory. My life could look very different today. That thought does not fill me with fear anymore. It fills me with gratitude because it reminds me that awareness is powerful, that asking questions is powerful, that slowing down is powerful. I want to share a few things I learnt through all of this, not as instructions, but as reminders. First, you do not owe anyone access to your finances simply because they are family. Love does not require financial exposure. Second, if someone tells you that you are confused, overwhelmed, or incapable, pause and check in with yourself before believing them. Your lived experience matters. Third, documentation is not distrust, it is protection. Fourth, boundaries are not punishments, they are guidelines for how others are allowed to treat you. And finally, it is never too late to take control back. Not at 60, not at 70, not ever. I know many of you listening are like me. You have spent decades caring for others, raising children, supporting partners, holding families together. You are used to putting yourself last. This story is not meant to scare you. It is meant to remind you of your strength, of your clarity, of your right to live without fear that someone else is quietly deciding your future for you. I want to speak personally for a moment. As I sit here now, telling this story, I feel something I didn't feel before. Pride, not loud pride, not boastful pride, but a steady knowing that I showed up for myself when it mattered most. I proved to myself that I could face something uncomfortable and come out stronger. I proved that my age is not a weakness. It is a source of wisdom, experience, perspective. I proved that I am not fragile. I am seasoned. And that realization has changed how I see the rest of my life. I wake up now and ask myself a different question, not what do others need from me today, but what do I need to feel secure and at peace? That one shift has made my days lighter. If you are listening to this and something inside you feels stirred, I want you to pay attention to that. Ask yourself a few honest questions. Who has access to your financial information? Who speaks for you when you are not in the room? Who benefits from you staying quiet? And perhaps most important, when was the last time you trusted your own instincts without asking permission? You do not have to confront anyone today. You do not have to make dramatic changes overnight. Sometimes the most powerful step is simply awareness. Sometimes it is choosing to listen to that small voice that says something is not right. And sometimes it is deciding that your peace is worth protecting. If this story resonated with you, I invite you to show a little support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It helps stories like this reach people who may need to hear them. And if you feel comfortable, leave a comment. Tell me what part of this story stayed with you. Tell me what age you are and where you are listening from. Your voice matters more than you know. I will leave you with this thought. That phone call almost took my home, but it gave me something far more valuable in return: clarity, confidence, and the courage to choose myself. May you find the same courage when life quietly asks you who you are willing to protect. And may you always remember that it is never selfish to guard the life you worked so hard to build.